Yeah, Beth. Thank you, Beth.
Well, welcome to the third collaborative educational meeting of the Colorado League of Women Voters News Access and Literacy Task Force and the Colorado Climate Emergency Task Force. My name is Sandy Schuster. Both of these task forces have members from all over the state. We encourage our task force members to share information with their local communities and local league members to educate everyone about two of the most critical issues of our time, communication and the environment. We also invite you to become members of one of or both of these task forces to stay informed on the latest information. Please stay on mute during the presentation, put questions in the chat, or save them until the Q&A at the end. Our next meeting will be on February 17th. Jane Hamburger will give us more information about that at the end of tonight's presentation. I would now like to introduce Dr. Kate Gilbert, a Larimer County League member. She will share her research and expertise on forever chemicals with us. Dr. Gilbert.
Thank you very much. And now we'll see if I can do this share thing correctly. Yes, here we go.
We got it.
It worked, Kate.
Yeah, good. Let me just get the slideshow going. Okay. Does that work? Does everybody see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So, as I said, my name's Kate Gilbert. I'm an immunotoxicologist and a member of League of Women Builders. And today we're going to be talking about forever chemicals. And specifically, we're going to talk about what we know about them, what we still don't know about them, and the misinformation surrounding them and how that misinformation is going to affect our future. So just to give you an idea of my qualifications, after I got my PhD, I did a postdoc at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. I worked doing research in London for a couple of years at the National Institute for Medical Research. I then joined the faculty at the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, and finally ended up at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, where I stayed for more than 20 years and retired as a tenured full professor. So most of my time was spent doing research, but once I joined the faculty at UAMS, I also, of course, did a lot of teaching. And I still have a part-time job doing science consulting. So my work has been focused on looking at how environmental pollutants cause immune dysfunction and disease. I have over 80 papers and book chapters. And in addition to my research, I've also done some regulatory work with the EPA. Specifically, in 1976, the Toxic Substance Control Act finally gave the EPA the power to actually regulate chemicals as opposed to just monitoring them. This was a huge deal. But as the time went by, people felt that the EPA was not living up to what they expected from them. They were not doing things in a timely fashion. So in 2016, President Obama signed off on the Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, which was an amendment to TSCA. And this act gave the EPA, demanded that the EPA evaluate existing chemicals that were considered high priority. And they had enforceable deadlines for those evaluations. In addition, the EPA was required to form a scientific advisory committee on chemicals with various experts to evaluate the EPA's work on these evaluations. And I was invited to be one of the inaugural members of the SAC committee. So over the 3 years that I was on the SAC,
Mm.
we evaluated
Mm.
10 different high priority chemicals, none of which were PFAS, because PFAS were just starting to show up on the radar for the EPA about that time. And I was part of the group that looked at the human health effects of these various chemicals and decided whether the EPA had adequately represented the toxicity of these chemicals and whether the regulatory rules that they were proposing made sense based on the science. So why are we talking about PFAS? So I think every scientist would agree that disease etiology is made up of genetics and the environment. And the contribution of these two factors to a particular disease varies considerably. Some diseases are very much dependent on genetics, like cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease, while others are much more dependent on the environment. And some of them, of course, most of them involve a contribution of both of these. So when we talk about the environment, that's kind of vague. It's basically anything that's not genetics. So what does that mean? What are the environmental contributions to disease? Some of them are lifestyle issues, like obesity and cigarette smoking. Some of them are as simple as aging. Some of them are infections, different viruses primarily. And then, of course, the one we're going to talk about today is the role of environmental pollutants in causing disease. And I just want to make sure everyone understands that these are not mutually exclusive. You can have several of these contributing to a single disease. But today we're going to be focusing on the environmental pollutants. Specifically, we're going to be talking about forever chemicals, also called polyfluoroalkyl substances, luckily abbreviated as PFAS. Now, this is kind of confusing because some of the other chemicals we'll be talking about sound very similar to this, but PFAS is the name for the general category of these substances. So these compounds came into being primarily at 3M with the invention of Teflon in 1938. Now, thousands of them have been now generated, and they've been added to all kinds of things: waterproof fabrics, cosmetics, furniture. The big thing is firefighting foam. You hear a lot about that. Food packaging, many, many more products. So why are PFAS so beloved by manufacturers? They're very durable. They improve the performance and lifespan of the product that they're attached to. They repel water and oil. They're cheap and easy to synthesize and to integrate into different products. But there was pretty early on some misinformation associated with these compounds. They thought that they were inert compounds not found in humans and therefore harmless. And we now have evidence that the companies knew that both of these things were untrue a long time before they admitted it. So why are PFAS not beloved by health professionals? It's because of their toxicity. We know that they suppress the immune system. You can find out that people who have higher levels of exposure to these have decreased ability to make antibodies in response to vaccinations. They've been found to increase the risk of certain cancers, liver toxicity, kidney cancer, and this is a big one. There have been definitely shown to impact reproductive and developmental effects. They're found in cord blood. They're found in breast milk. And there's no question that pre and postnatal exposure to PFAS can have negative effects on development. So why are they toxic? And this is the thing we're going to talk about was we still don't know a lot about these chemicals. They're still pretty new. But what do we know so far? Well, the main thing that we all know is that they bioaccumulate in blood, liver, and kidneys. They're very long lasting. And they got their nickname, forever chemicals, by the Washington Post because many of them have very long half-lives in both the environment and in the human body. So we hear about half-life. What does it actually mean? So for example, if you ingested some chemical and they looked for the levels of that chemical the next day and found it to be 30 micrograms per liter. And then they measured the levels of that chemical in your blood over time. The half-life, of course, is when that 30 micrograms per liter is halved. That is when it becomes 15 micrograms per liter. And in this case, the 100% goes to 50%, that is half, by 8 years. And it takes another 8 years for that 15 to be divided in two, and another 8 years to be further divided in two. So you can see under these circumstances, a chemical could last a very long time in your blood. So how do PFAS half-lives compare to other contaminants? So all of these contaminants have half-lives, but they're in like days or hours. Mercury and lead have half-lives of weeks, but some PFAS have half-lives as long as 8 years. And so these don't even show up on the scale that we're using here. You can see these PFAS last in the blood and in the environment much longer than other chemicals. So why do they have such long half-lives? So this is a little bit of a sciencey slide. I hope it's okay. First, we're going to talk about normal chemicals. As somebody who likes science fiction, I'm constantly reminded that we are carbon-based life forms. And so carbon forms the basis, of course, of organic molecules, which make up the vast majority of the chemicals we need for our body. That means proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. And the most common bond with carbon is a hydrogen bond. That is the most common bond in molecules associated with life on this planet. And this bond strength is very strong, but is readily metabolized. So this is kind of what we're using as our baseline normal. And here's an example of a small carbon-based molecule, ethane. And you can see that the carbon has 3 hydrogens on it. Now we come to PFAS. And instead of carbons having hydrogens on them, they have fluorine molecules on them. So the basic definition of a PFAS is it has to have at least one carbon that is fully fluorinated. That is, it has 3 fluorines on it. Now, this particular bond, unlike carbon-hydrogen bonds, is very rare in nature. But it turns out they can be readily synthesized. And unlike the carbon-hydrogen bonds, the carbon-fluorine bonds are very strong and not easily metabolized. Here's an example of one of the PFAS we're going to talk a lot about, which is perfluorooctanoic acid, also known as PFOA. And then here is an example of a very small PFAS, trifluoroacetic acid, TFA. But you can see that they both have the fluorine molecules attached to them, which makes them very difficult to metabolize. So what else do we know about the toxicity? We know they accumulate, as we said, which is one of the bad things for chemicals, is if they bioaccumulate. And they do that in part by binding to proteins. And that binding can inhibit protein function. There are many different ways why binding of a chemical to a protein is going to interrupt its function. And because of that, they can activate biological pathways that cause cancer by promoting cell growth, damaging DNA, and the part that I'm always interested in, suppressing the immune response. So this is what we know about the toxicity so far. Why don't we know more? Why are we still uncertain about a lot of aspects of PFAS toxicity? And why is it turning out to be hard to come up with regulatory values? And that's partly because there's still very little information about these compared to other chemicals. For example, okay, so this is PubMed, and I use this all the time. This is the search engine from the NIH. And almost every peer-reviewed paper that is published about human health effects end up being listed on PubMed. And you can use their search engine to find those papers. And PubMed also sort of keeps track of the number of these papers published over the years. So I looked up trichloroethylene. That's the chemical I've done most of my research on. And you can see that we're starting to see papers on the health effects of TCE back in 1952, and it has only gotten more robust as time goes on. So that means that basically we have 70 years of research to learn about its toxicity and to inform our regulatory decisions. Here's another example, asbestos. We've got more than 60 years of papers being published to evaluate the toxicity of asbestos. And now PFAS. There were a few trickling in, but really the majority of papers have only been published in the last 12, 14 years. And I could tell you that when you're deciding on the toxicity of a chemical, you use lots of information. You use animal studies, you use epidemiology studies, you use in vitro studies that look at the mechanism of action, and you put all that together before you decide on how toxic a substance is and what the regulatory values should be. We just haven't had enough time for that to happen. It's still a relatively short research period for determining all the things we need to know about PFAS toxicity. That's why we're still struggling with certain aspects of this. So we still don't know a lot about its toxicity, but we do know something about its exposure. And most of the exposure right now from PFAS comes from drinking water. And drinking water comes from surface water and from groundwater. And there are many ways in which PFAS can leach out or run off, can go into either of those sources of drinking water. So for now, that is the main source of PFAS in humans, is from all that runoff and leaching into the water system. And once it gets in the water system, it's really difficult to remove them. They are notoriously resistant to most forms of degradation, including the ones that people usually use to get rid of chemicals. Most water treatment plants are not designed to deal with them because of this difficulty. Municipal drinking water plants filter out some, but 45% of tap water contains PFAS. Upgrading the water plants to get rid of the PFAS is very expensive, time-consuming, and it should be noted, is not yet required by the EPA. So how extensive is this contamination? Well, in 2025, the EPA reported that 23 million people in this country are being exposed to PFAS in their drinking water. And this is interesting. A worldwide study of 45,000 different groundwater samples from across the world found, even though they were seemingly uncontaminated, found that 31% contained levels of PFAS that were actually harmful to human health. And I'm sure you've read that PFAS have been discovered in sites all around the world, the North Pole, the South Pole, and even in the animals that live in those areas. So let's look at PFAS in Colorado. So the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has great resources. And one of them is this PFAS concentration map. So that department has looked at the levels of 2 of the PFAS, which is irritatingly close to the general name PFOS. PFAS is the general category. PFOS is a particular PFAS, and PFO is another one. Now, these are what they call long chain PFAS, and they were the ones that were used the most initially in manufacturing. And so they're the ones that we know the most about because they've been around longer. And based on that information, the EPA has set a maximum contaminant level of 4 nanograms per liter in drinking water of both of those chemicals. So the maximum contaminant level, of course, means the level that's acceptable in water below which you should be safe and above which they can't guarantee that you'll be safe. So Colorado took, seemingly, as far as I can tell, random samples of groundwater and surface water and well water from around Colorado. And the squares are the surface water, the round ones are the groundwater, and the purple ones are public wells. And you can go into this site and click on any one of these different icons, and it will tell you where it was from and what exactly the levels of PFAS, of those 2 PFAS, were at that site. So if you're curious about what it's like in your particular area, this is a really great resource. So the MCL for those is 4 nanograms per liter. Now we're finding in and they report the results as a combination of those 2. They don't report them individually. So for example, the Poudre River, we're finding the additive effects of PFOS and PFO as 24 nanograms per liter, which is, of course, higher than 4 nanograms per liter. But this is surface water. So unless you're drinking out of the Poudre, you would not be exposed to that. But still, it's kind of weird. Why should there be PFAS in the Poudre? And there's some in the other surface water, and especially high in some of the water associated with landfills, because as we said, landfill leaching is one of the main sources of PFAS. And in this particular one, we're seeing levels at 16,500 nanograms per liter. And this one's kind of alarming because a lot of the public water systems evaluate PFAS levels. Not all of them, but a lot of them. But private wells are not evaluated. And something like 17% of people in this country use private wells for either drinking water or for watering their crops. And in this particular one, the private well water, the levels were over 2,000 nanograms per liter, which obviously is considerably higher than the MCL. So this is all, though, groundwater and surface water. What about actual drinking water? So once again, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has this map, which looks at levels of PFAS in actual finished drinking water. Now, this is not all the different water systems in Colorado, but it's some of them. And once again, they only looked at those two, PFOA and PFOS. And they show you that the circles in red represent areas of drinking water that exceed that MCL of 4 nanograms per liter. And the blue ones do not exceed that. But you should know that even in the ones that have exceeded the MCL, they are not yet required to do anything about it. And we'll talk about that a bit more. So what levels of PFAS are actually getting into people with all that drinking water? So this is an amazing resource. The NHANES survey, which has been conducted by the CDC for over 60 years. And they take blood samples from people across the country and look at various chemicals and nutrients, all kinds of different things in the blood. In this particular set of samples, they look at different chemicals in different surveys. But this particular one, which is almost 20 years, they looked at the levels of 4 PFOS, including the ones we're talking most about, PFOS and PFOA. And the blue lines represent the levels of those chemicals in the blood of adults, and the red is the level of those chemicals in teenagers. And in a couple of these years, they also looked at toddlers. And I hate to tell you, but the levels of these PFAS in 3 to 5-year-olds are exactly the same as they are in adults. Now, these two we talked about. These are the ones that were initially used as PFAS in manufacturing. And once it looks like there was some evidence that they were toxic, they were voluntarily used less. So not surprisingly, the blood levels have gone down, even though they have not gone down to 0. They sort of have leveled off. But they stopped collecting this data in 2018. So one of the main PFAS misinformation elements is that since those long-chain PFAS have been banned in favor of the safe short-chain PFAS. So you're saying, well, what difference does it make? But we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's some regulatory information, which I think is really interesting. So finally, in 2024, the EPA actually came out with some regulatory information, rules set forth for PFAS. And those two the two ones we already talked about, were designated as having MCLs, as we said before, 4 nanograms per liter. And these other two long chain were designated as having MCLs as 10 nanograms per liter. And the one short chain chemical, which they looked at, this GenX chemical, which we'll talk about in a minute, was also listed as 10 nanograms per liter as the amount of below which is safe and above which is not considered safe. So they set that out in 2024, and they notified the public water systems that they had until 2027 to actually monitor this. Because like I said, a lot of the water systems have not yet measured these chemicals. And if the levels exceeded the MCL set out here, they had until 2029 to implement solutions to reduce the PFAS. Now, fast forward to 2025, and Trump's EPA has expanded that compliance date till 2031. And also, it has rescinded the MCLs for those 3 other PFAS. So right now, there are no set regulatory values for those other PFAS. That means that even if they measure them in the drinking water, the EPA has not set a limit for them. So let's just talk about short chain PFAS. So when it became evident that some of the long chain PFAS, which were particularly good at sticking around in the environment in the body, were actually toxic, the manufacturers did a couple of really quick studies and showed that the shorter chain ones have much shorter half-lives, which is true. And they also did a few studies that, as far as they were concerned, showed that these short chain were less toxic. And those chemicals, the shorter chain ones, are lumped together under what they call Gen X chemicals. So they went ahead and started using those chemicals, even though they had a very sketchy hazard identification process. And now, subsequently, animal studies have shown that oral exposure to those damages a bunch of different systems. And then aside from the short chain, we have the ultra short chain PFAS. The main one we talk about is trifluoroacetic acid. It's very persistent. It doesn't stay in the body very long, but it stays in the environment a long time. It's not metabolized, and it's very water soluble. It shows up, it moves everywhere, and it's very mobile in water and causes liver and reproductive toxicity. So, the long chain ones have not been banned. There's just some vague regulatory rules associated with them. And the short chain ones have not been shown to be safe. So, more PFAS misinformation. If water test levels show low or non-detect, there's no exposure risk. And that's just not true. It depends on different water systems are going to use different assays to measure them, and they're all going to have different detection limits. So if one water system has a detection limit that's much higher than the water system, 100 miles from there, they're going to may say that there's no chemical there, whereas a more sensitive test would show that there was. The other trouble is that we now know that there are literally thousands of PFAS, and these tests are not specific for all of them. And the other thing that the Trump EPA has done has decided that the cumulative exposure with multiple low-level PFAS, which the previous EPA said you had to consider when you were looking at toxicity, even though each one individually might be low, if you added them all up, you had to consider the cumulative exposure. The new EPA is saying you don't need to do that. You're just going to be worried about the levels of an individual PFAS. Some people think that all PFAS are equally toxic. As I said before, there are now thousands of them, many of which have not been well studied, but which appear to have wildly different toxicity properties. And the other one you've heard a lot, may have heard a lot about recently, as from the EPA, is that pesticides do not contain PFAS, because they want to be able to use pesticides without worrying about that. But the reality is that some pesticides are considered PFAS, and some other pesticides are metabolized to PFAS, including that little short PFAS TFA. So that is just not true. More information, misinformation. You can avoid PFAS exposure with just a few changes. If you take really robust measures, like using PFAS-specific filters, avoiding fast food, cooking without using nonstick pans, avoiding stain and water-resistant products, use only, it should have been PFAS-free chemicals or cosmetics, vacuum with a HEPA filter, which gets up the PFAS dust, which is a big issue, you can reduce your intake by a considerable amount. However, that will only reduce your blood levels by a certain amount, by up to 50% in 5 years. And that's because these things, once they're in your body, have a very long, they'll stick around for a long time. And this was all done before these new short chain ones, which are now everywhere. And they are much harder to actually get out of the drinking water. So it's not that easy to avoid them. Okay. So aside from the SAC committee, I've worked with the EPA for different projects over the years. And I've never had anything but the utmost respect for their professionalism and their scientific integrity. And I still feel that way about the scientists that work there. The administration is a completely different issue. Many previous EPA directors had backgrounds in science and administration, and a lot of them had actually worked at the EPA. They emphasized the crucial role of the EPA in protecting the environment and human health. That is the role of the EPA. That brings us to the current director of the EPA, which his name is Lee Zeldin. So he is a close friend of President Trump. He actually represented him at an impeachment hearing. And he was a congressman for New York for some years. He quit to run for governor and lost to Kathy Hochul. So now being at loose ends and having no background in science, but he had the one qualification that matters. His loyalty to President Trump. He was awarded to be the director of the EPA, and the GOP Congress confirmed him. He knows nothing about science, and his main agenda, and you can hear him say this on the EPA website, is pushing deregulation. His stated goal as director is to lower the cost of buying a car, heating a home, and running a business. And then he says later on, as sort of an aside, while at the same time protecting the environment. Here's another example. So the CERCLA hazardous substances are those substances which are found in Superfund sites, those massive pollution dumps. And if you are working with a chemical that gets listed on the CERCLA site as a particularly hazardous substance, you're not going to be happy. There's a lot more regulation involved. There's a lot more reporting involved, and your site can be, the EPA can decide that your site is a Superfund site that needs to be cleaned up, and you have a lot more liability and for retroactive contamination. So nobody wants the chemicals they're working with to get on the CERCLA list. But in 2024, once again, before the new director issued a ruling called the intending that those two that we've talked about, PFOA and PFOS, be put on the CERCLA list, so that they would be monitored as potential Superfund chemicals. Now, naturally, the people who work with these didn't want that. So they pushed back with the help of a lawyer named Stephen Cook. In 2025, Lee Zeldin offered Stephen Cook a high-level job at the EPA. In fact, he put him in the department he's working at is the department that controls Superfund sites. So as a EPA representative, Cook met with the heads in 2025 of these major polluters. And the very next day, an internal committee at the EPA recommended that 2024 ruling, putting those on the Superfund site list, be rescinded. Now, so far, the ruling has not been rescinded, but there's evidence that it is under review. So, in total, what can we say about Zeldin and the PFAS and the EPA? They say that they're working on these, and that they reiterate how important it is to prevent PFAS contamination and to deal with it. But what they've actually done is rolled back or rescinded parts of the standards. They've extended the compliance deadlines. And they've decided that one of the PFAS that we're seeing so much of these days, one of these real new short ones, is not actually a PFAS. And even though it's causing toxicity, since they decided it's not a PFAS, they don't have to worry about it. And of course, they've also cut the EPA staff by 33%. Now, I just want to reiterate, there's no question, there's nothing to say that the EPA is going to ban PFAS. All they're doing is trying to figure out ways to prevent it from getting in the water supply to the consumers. So what can we do? Well, if you really want to, you can use the mitigation techniques I talked about before. And that includes using filters, specific filters. But those filters don't get out a lot of the new smaller PFAS. And you have to use some elaborate reverse osmosis process to get. You can get that for your home, but it's not cheap. You can, now Colorado is going along with the EPA in terms of the regulations, in terms of the MCLs and when they need to be enforced. But they do have an action plan, and they have passed some legislation to ban the use of products with PFAS in this state. And they also have a regulation to deal with the PFAS in the firefighting foam, which is a big issue. The firefighting foam has ended up putting a lot of PFAS. If you look at a lot of military bases, the soil and the water surrounding them are heavily contaminated with PFAS, and it's partly because they're always using and practicing with these firefighting foams. But the most important thing we can do is make sure that we're going to screen and only elect legislators who insist that the EPA is led by people that actually use real scientific information to guide their policy, rather than people that use misinformation to mislead the public and to placate industrial lobbyists. And that's it for me. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions in the chat. Amy says that she's worked with issues related to the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which is adjacent to Toxic Control, the Toxic Control Act. And she's noticed there are two major obstacles to enforcement. One is loopholes, such as conditional registration, and the second is little to no capacity and/or oversight. Does the Toxic Control Act face similar issues? If so, can we depend on the EPA? Well, I think you just said no. And then if not, is there any substitute to help protect ourselves and our communities?
Well, as I said, the EPA is being slow or misleading. But a lot of the states have taken this into their own hands and are passing laws to, like I said, some of them are banning the products. And I know Colorado has also, you can get your well water tested for free. I know that they also have they've entered into several lawsuits. I know that that with states around the country, like 3M, I think, is being sued for something like $14 billion. And if at some point Colorado will get some of that money to help with the retrofitting of the water systems here. So basically, if the federal level is leaving us behind, we have to really press our state legislators to do what they can locally.
Okay, and Jane would like to know, is the fluoride in toothpaste in our city water the same as what you are, the PFAS?
No,
Good to know.
fluoride is pretty safe. And every dentist I talk to swears that we should never take fluoride out of the water.
Okay. And Sonia would like to know if we should expect the immune systems, etc., of animals drinking in the river to be affected by
Sure,
the, yeah, okay.
absolutely. I mean, they've tested it on lab animals, and I'm sure the same effects we're going to see in the animals that are consuming this directly from the sources. Plus, PFAS are in food. You can find them in leafy vegetables and fruit. And I don't know if you just saw last week, some NGO in Germany tested breakfast cereals and found that over 80% of them had PFAS in them. So PFAS are in grains, they're in lots of different foods as well as in the water. And anything that eats those is going to be exposed to those, which is why we see, PFAS in polar bears, because they're drinking the water that has been contaminated with these chemicals. So I think just about every animal they've tested, they're finding PFAS in.
Okay, and then Bridget has a question. What is your thought on what and how do we deal with these given the significance of their levels and the potential health concerns they can create?
Well, I think scientists, which are already on the job, need to keep working at demonstrating the toxicity and finding out the actual levels of toxicity. So far, that's still a large unknown. And we need to make sure that we get good people at the EPA. They're the ones who are in charge of this. And they're the ones that actually set the agenda for a lot of the states, even though the states are trying to do workarounds to fix some of this. But the most important thing is that we need good people in the EPA.
Okay, Sandy has a question.
I know you don't know the answer to this, but I would
Oh.
like your opinion.
Okay.
What do you think about the possibility that the large increase in pancreatic and other digestive system cancers is attached to PFAS?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. And that's partly because they're still trying to figure out for sure which cancers are associated with it. But right now, I think they've limited it to, they say that liver cancer, kidney cancer. They have said that testicle cancer and breast cancer, maybe there's some links to that, but I don't remember seeing anything about pancreatic cancer yet. But like I said, this is all very early days. And, doing these epidemiology studies we've only been looking at these chemicals for a relatively short time, and doing the epi studies on these take a long time. And so maybe some of that will be coming out soon, but we can only hope so. I don't mean to sound totally gloom and doom about this, but you know, a lot of these PFAS are probably going to have to be present in high enough concentrations, and we're still trying to figure that out. So I guess we can take some solace in the fact that maybe they're not going to be, it's going to be hard to get rid of them, but maybe we can keep them at a level that won't be too bad. Now, see, Europe is taking a different approach. They're trying to ban PFAS as a whole category. They're not worrying about the individual chain length and the individual PFAS. Plus, they're putting a lot of money into figuring out substitutes for these chemicals as far as manufacturing goes. So it will make it easier for manufacturers to say, hey, I'm just not going to use these anymore, which is an approach that we could use here if we had the right leadership.
Okay, and Kathy Marr has a question. What kinds of reproductive and developmental effects have been identified to be associated with PFAS exposure?
Okay. Well, like I said, it's clear that both pre and postnatal exposure occurs. And they have found that the immune system of newborns is compromised. And they can relate that to the levels of PFAS in the cord blood. And they have also shown that you get epigenetic changes in your cells. And epigenetic changes impact the DNA. They're not mutations, but they can control the expression of genes. And that can definitely have effects on causing cancer and other diseases. And they find those epigenetic changes in newborns. Once again, that they can correlate with the levels of PFAS in the cord blood. And there also is some neurological effects. Now, some people, and this is controversial still, have said that they can correlate PFAS levels with certain neurological diseases like autism and ADHD. But that has been, it's still up in the air for that. But they have seen other kinds of neurological effects based on the developmental exposure to these chemicals. So, especially if you're thinking about getting pregnant, you know, it would be a good idea to find out for sure what your water levels were, and either buy water which has been shown to be lower in PFAS, or to have some sort of filter on your water system. Because there's a lot of reasons why developing organisms are much more sensitive to all kinds of contaminants, including PFAS. A lot of their systems that we use to fight off contamination, to repair different things that the contaminants do, they're not working completely right yet in newborns. The immune system, the brain, the neural system, they're all in the developing stage, and it's so much easier to impact the long-term effects if chemical exposure occurs then versus in adults. And that's been shown for many different chemicals.
Okay, and then Sonia and Deborah have just about the same question. I can't believe it, one right after the other. So I'm going to combine them.
Okay.
Are PFAS tested in organic food products? Should they be added for testing to qualify for an organic label? And if my family purchases organic food products, will that reduce PFAS ingestion?
That is a really good question, and I don't actually know the answer to that. I mean, as far as I know, organic foods means they don't use pesticides or insecticides. But they don't, as far as I know, they're not worried about the water that they're using to grow these plants with. And there's no reason that PFAS won't be in that water and won't end up in the crops. So I don't think that buying organic is a guarantee that you will not have PFAS in your food.
And it
But-
would be difficult to add it to a label because the water and yeah.
And the other thing is that they're still working out the methodology to test these chemicals. And so I don't know how easy it would be to test any particular food for a whole variety of PFAS at this point. There may be, that may be coming down the pike, but right now, I don't think it's available.
And then Amy says there's very little capacity for oversight on organics also. Few products are tested.
Yeah, I don't actually know that much about organic food, but I'm sure that's true. And I know that's frustrating because you feel like if you're buying organic, you shouldn't have to worry about things. But at least as far as PFAS go, I don't know that that's the case.
Okay, that's all the questions I see in the chat. Does anybody else have questions?
I'd just like to say that this is a very interesting and well presented program that is easy to understand.
Well,
And
thank
I really
you.
appreciate it.
Well, Kathy
you.
has a question.
Yeah, I asked this in the chat, but then I thought I think you were answering the question right as I was typing my question. But could you reiterate for me, please, when can we expect to see reporting of PFAS levels in water reports? Like for my local water provider reports all kinds of chemicals and metals, but never lists any PFAS. So I think you said something about when we might be able
Right.
to.
So some, local water systems do, and you can get that information from their websites, but they're not required to monitor these or to report these until 2027. And right now they have until 2031 to do something about that if they find the levels are above.
Okay. And
Okay.
is that a state requirement or a national requirement?
Both.
Okay, thank you.
So it's national and the state has adopted the same.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, Kate, if you'll stop the screen sharing, I want to give you
Yeah.
a full screen thank you for this information and for the expertise that you have, as well as something that we can do that we do best, and that is to be active in educating people about this so that they can vote intelligently and so that we can work on the laws and regulations that are certainly affected by this. I know, holy cow, at least personally, I think right after we get off of this, I'm going to go buy a reverse osmosis water purifier for me and my dog anyway.
I kind of figure it's too late for me, so
I've
Yeah.
looked at them and they're very expensive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for my forever is not very long. I just also wanted to let you all know that the recording from tonight, along with the slides of Kate's information, will be on the League's Colorado website in a few days. Our past presentations are also there under the About Us heading. And I also want to tell you, all of you, about our February 17th subject in this series of myths and disinformation about science. It's going to be a fireside chat format with science moms about talking with your children about what they hear, the scary stuff that they internalize and how they experience about that scary news of climate emergency. And a little bit about the science. Moms, they are a national nonpartisan organization of university scientists who are also moms and grandmoms and women in science. From Colorado State University's Department of Atmospheric Science, Dr. Emily Fisher will meet with us at the Zoom fireplace for a chat to hear your questions and comments about explaining climate change to your children. That means children of all ages and stages of how they perceive their world. Please invite anyone who can benefit from this. Ask them to bring their climate emergency questions and their experiences, and also about dealing with the way wrong information is interpreted about toddlers to middle schoolers to graduate students. Once a mom, you're always a mom, and your students are going to be having these questions. In other words, this is going to be a discussion that will depend on the questions that are asked and Dr. Fisher's ability, which is vast, to respond and empathize with you. So bring also tips that worked for you. We also want to share ideas to give children a way they can be part of the solution. You can Google Science Moms to learn more about them and see their 2025 Super Bowl commercial about them that the New York Times voted as the 8th best of that day. And they will be with us.
Wow.
Yeah. So, anything else? Good. Thanks for coming and good night.
Good
Thank you,
night.
Kate.
Good night.
Oh, my pleasure.